My kids put papers in front of me and said, "Mom, it's just for medical insurance, sign it." I picked up the pen, but when I looked closer, it was a contract to sell my library, my life's work, for just a few thousand. They called it a formality. Not long after, I opened an old book and found a manuscript experts valued at tens of millions. That's when I knew my own children were ready to take everything from me. The library had its own kind of silence, the sort that hummed instead of pressed. I'd lived in that quiet most of my life. The wooden shelves smelled of lemon oil and old paper, and the floor creaked in places I could find blindfolded. 64 years old and still dusting spines like they were fine china, still shushing the rowdy high schoolers who came in pretending to study. I thought I'd spend the rest of my years with those books for company. But then came the doctor's voice. Calm, professional, but final in its way. My health wasn't what it used to be. "Declining," he said, as if it were a slope I was sliding down with no handrail. I didn't faint or cry. I just folded my coat over my arm and walked back to my library. But the news must have traveled faster than I'd expected, because not a week later my children started showing up, together as if on rotation. First it warmed me. My boys hadn't been in the same room without bickering since the late 80s. My daughter, always too busy, suddenly called twice a day. They carried groceries in, stacked dishes in the sink, fussed over me like hens. But the house didn't fill with comfort. It filled with noise, sharp, restless noise. I'd sit in my chair by the window, listening as they paced the kitchen, lowering their voices only when I appeared. It was never really about me. Not the way they said, "We just want you comfortable, Mom," they'd murmur, patting my shoulder. Yet their conversations circled like vultures. Insurance, inheritance, arrangements. Words that left a taste of iron in my mouth. One evening my eldest spread a folder across the kitchen table. "Just paperwork," he said, pushing the pages toward me. "Insurance forms. Medical coverage. You don't want to be caught unprepared." His smile didn't meet his eyes. My daughter chimed in. "It's routine, Mama. Just your signature. We'll handle the rest." I looked at those papers. Black print swimming in the lamplight. My hand hovered over the pen, and for a moment I thought of giving in. It would have been easier. Just a quick scrawl of my name, the way I'd signed school slips and permission notes 1,000 times before. But the library keys were still heavy in my apron pocket, and something in me stiffened. I pushed the pen aside. "Later," I told them. "My eyes are tired." That night, lying awake, I listened to the rain strike the roof while my children whispered in the hallway. Their voices weren't low enough to hide the urgency. I caught phrases. Assets. Just a matter of time. If she doesn't sign. My heart beat hard against the pillow. The library wasn't just a building to me. It was breath. It was the life I had built when everything else, marriage, health, even friendships, fell apart. And now my own children circled it like buyers at an auction. The next day I went back to work as usual. The library's hush wrapped around me, steadier than any embrace. I polished the brass knobs, reshelved the returns, inhaled the musk of books that had outlived generations. It was in that stillness that I felt the storm waiting at home. My daughter arrived just before closing, too polished for a casual visit. She perched on the desk, swinging her heel, slipping another set of forms in front of me. "Mama, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're only trying to help." I looked at her, really looked. She wore my mother's brooch, the one I'd given her last Christmas, but it glinted now like a prize already claimed. I folded the papers without opening them and slid them back. "Not today." Her smile thinned. She gathered her purse, kissed my cheek, and left without checking the clock. When I finally locked up the library that evening, the air outside was thick, swollen with storm clouds. I carried the key ring heavy in my hand and wondered how much longer it would be mine to hold. At home, the voices started again. My sons this time debating in the kitchen while I boiled water for tea. They didn't even lower their tones. She won't sign. She's stalling. She has to. Otherwise, what's the point? I stirred the sugar into my cup and set the spoon down quietly, though my hand trembled. The storm outside broke just then, thunder cracking across the sky. Inside, the storm had only begun. The papers appeared again 2 mornings later. This time they didn't even bother with pretense. My eldest, Martin, had them already spread across the kitchen table when I came in with the kettle. Steam still curled from the spout when he said, "Mama, it's time we got this squared away." I set the kettle down slow, the whistle still ringing in my ears. "What's that?" I asked, though I already knew. "Insurance forms," he repeated, tapping the page with a thick finger. His tone was casual, practiced, but there was a sharpness under it. "Just a signature right here. For your coverage." My other son, Daniel, leaned against the counter with his arms folded, watching. My daughter, Carol, busied herself with rearranging the salt shaker and napkins as if the table setting mattered more than the paper between us. I lowered myself into the chair. The print was bold, official-looking. I'd spent my whole life handling library acquisitions, reading contracts, deciphering old catalogs. My eyes weren't as quick as they once were, but they hadn't failed me yet. I adjusted my glasses and began to read. And that's when I saw it. The word leapt out like a needle in cloth. Transfer. Not insurance. Not medical care. Transfer of property. The library. My library. Listed clear as day. The sum? I blinked twice thinking I'd misread. But no. It was right there. A sale price so low it could barely cover a used car. My hand froze on the edge of the paper. I could feel Martin's gaze burning into me. "What's wrong?" he asked too quickly. "It's just a formality. Don't strain your eyes, Mama. We'll explain it." I didn't move. I just kept reading. Every line turned colder. My name printed neatly in boxes, the place for my signature waiting like an open trap. Carol gave a nervous laugh. "Mama, don't fuss over it. These things are all the same, pages and pages of nonsense nobody understands. That's why we're here, to help." I raised my head slowly. Their faces were familiar, but in that moment, they might as well have been strangers. Martin drummed his fingers impatiently. Daniel's jaw worked back and forth like he was grinding his teeth. I reached for the pen. My hand shook as I lifted it, and for a second I thought I'd give in. Habit, maybe. A lifetime of signing forms for doctors, schools, taxes. Always trusting. Always assuming my children had my best interest at heart. But then something stopped me. Not a thunderbolt. Not some grand revelation. Just a flicker of memory. The library doors opening in the morning. That wave of paper and dust air that greeted me like an old friend. The children's story hour where I had sat cross-legged on the floor, reading fairy tales until my knees ached. The old man who came every Tuesday to borrow the same war memoir because it kept his memories alive. Those weren't numbers on a page. That wasn't just property. That was my life. I set the pen back down. "I'll read it through first," I said. My voice was steady, though my throat was dry. Martin leaned in, his shadow falling across the page. "There's nothing to read, Mama. It's boilerplate. We don't want you stressing. Just sign it." I looked up at him. If it's nothing, then it won't hurt to let me read. The silence stretched. Carol shifted in her chair, fussing with her sweater. Daniel muttered something under his breath. Finally, Martin snatched the papers back, too fast, too rough, as if the ink might smudge if I looked too long. "Fine. Later," he said, his voice clipped. "But don't drag this out. You're making it harder than it needs to be." He shoved the papers into his folder and snapped it shut. The sound made me flinch. They left soon after, muttering about errands, about handling things. The door closed behind them with a thud that rattled the glass in the frame. I sat at the table long after the kettle had gone cold. My hand still hovered over the spot where the pen had rested. I imagined the black ink of my name sealing away everything I'd ever worked for, handing over the library for pennies, as if it were a box of junk to be carted off. That night, I walked the library halls long after closing. I touched the spines one by one, my fingers brushing cloth, leather, paper that had survived generations, books people had tried to throw away, donations that came in boxes marked useless, treasures hidden in plain sight. I whispered to them the way I always had when I was alone. Not yet. You're not leaving me yet. But at home I could feel the pressure mounting. My children weren't finished. That much was certain. And I knew now, I'd have to be ready for the next trap they laid. The next week the library felt different. The air hung heavier, as if even the dust had caught wind of what was happening at home. I moved slower between the shelves, my back aching more than usual, though I wouldn't admit it to anyone. I refused to give my children that satisfaction. That afternoon, as I was stacking a return cart, a familiar voice rang out across the empty reading room. "Still hiding among the stacks, are you?" I turned, and there he was, Henry Clayton, gray hair wild as ever, spectacles sliding down his nose, his arms already burdened with a stack of oversized folios. Henry had been our bibliographer years back before retirement, the sort of man who could identify a 16th century binding by smell alone. We hadn't seen much of each other lately, but his grin was the same. Crooked, mischievous, as if he knew more than anyone else in the room. "Henry," I said, my voice catching, "what brings you here?" He plunked the folios onto the nearest table and leaned on his cane. "Curiosity. And a rumor. Thought I'd see for myself if it was true." "What rumor?" "That you've been sitting on a dragon's hoard without knowing it." I frowned, confused. He explained in his usual roundabout way, tapping the table for emphasis. He'd heard whispers in the collector's circles that our little town library, so ordinary to most, housed editions with peculiar markings, signatures, or hidden inserts. "Things worth more than your entire building," he said, lowering his voice. "And I'm not talking a few $1,000s. I'm talking fortunes." I laughed at first, brushing it off as one of Henry's eccentricities. But then he reached into his folio and pulled out a slip of paper, a list written in his scratchy hand. "These are the titles I want to see," he said. "I noticed markers last time I passed through. Someone, maybe you, maybe a careless volunteer, put them aside without realizing." My hands went cold as I took the list. Every book he'd named was one I'd shelved in the quiet corner, rare, fragile volumes I'd always treated gently but never valued beyond their history. Could it be true? Before I could respond, the door to the library opened. Heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. My children. They hadn't told me they were coming, but I wasn't surprised. Martin led the way, Daniel just behind, and Carol trailing, her eyes flicking nervously between us. Their timing was too precise to be chance. They'd overheard. "What's all this?" Martin asked, his voice deceptively light. He glanced at the paper in my hand, then at Henry, his eyes narrowing. Henry, oblivious or pretending to be, straightened. "Just a bit of bibliographic curiosity. Nothing to alarm you, young man." But Martin wasn't fooled. He strode forward and snatched the list from my hand. His eyes darted down the page, and I saw it then, the change in his expression. Until now, they'd thought of the library as something to unload for a quick check. But in that moment, the truth bloomed in their greedy faces. There was more here than they'd imagined. Daniel stepped closer, his tone sharper. "What exactly are you implying, sir? That these dusty old books are worth something?" Henry's eyes gleamed. "More than something. Quite a lot if you know where to look." Carol shifted uncomfortably, but her brothers were already caught. I could see the hunger in them, like wolves catching the scent of meat. I forced a smile and reached for the list, my hand steady despite the fear curling in my stomach. "Thank you, Henry," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "I'll take it from here." He hesitated, glanced at me, then nodded. Something in my eyes must have told him to stop talking. My children lingered after he left, prowling the aisles as though the books might start spilling coins out of their spines. I followed them quietly, watching the way their hands hovered too long over the shelves, their whispers sharp and urgent. That evening I caught them again in my kitchen. They didn't bother to lower their voices this time. "If those books are worth real money," Martin hissed, "we can't wait around for her. She'll cling to them forever." Daniel's reply was colder still. "Then we make her sign. One way or another." My chest tightened. I stood in the hallway, hidden in the dark, listening to the children-eyed raised plot against me. They weren't talking about care or comfort anymore. They were talking about treasure, about gain, about taking what wasn't theirs. And I knew Henry had been right. There was more here than anyone had realized. But he hadn't known what kind of storm his curiosity had unleashed. That night I left the kitchen lights burning. Maybe it was foolish, but I thought brightness might keep the shadows out. I sat at the table with my teacup, listening to the storm still rattling the gutters outside. My children had gone quiet after Henry's visit, but their silence felt heavier than their words. I tried to busy myself, folding dish towels, wiping crumbs that weren't there, anything to keep my hands steady. But the house was too still. I heard every creak in the floorboards, every tick of the old clock on the mantel. Then came the sound that made me freeze, a hushed voice in the kitchen. I set the towel down and held my breath. The voices grew clearer as I edged toward the hallway. It was my sons, their tones sharp, almost spitting. I leaned against the wall, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they'd hear. Martin's voice, low and bitter. "She's never going to sign. You saw the way she clutched those papers, like she knew exactly what they were. She'll drag this out until it's too late." Daniel answered, his words tight and clipped. "Then we don't wait. We sign for her." For a moment I thought I'd misheard. My knees went weak, and I gripped the wall to steady myself. Martin muttered, "Forgery isn't even hard. Half the time she scribbles anyway. A shaky hand, no one will question it." Carol's voice broke in then, softer but no less cruel. "It'll be worse if she finds out what those books are worth. Did you hear that old fool? Tens of thousands, maybe more. We can't let her keep it all locked away until she dies. We need to act." There was a pause, heavy as thunder. Then Daniel again. "If she fights us, we make her sign. One way or another." I felt the words like a knife to the chest. My own children, my blood, plotting in my kitchen as if I were just an obstacle, not their mother. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The kettle whistled faintly where I'd left it, and I prayed they wouldn't hear the blood pounding in my ears. Martin sighed. "We'll give her one more chance tomorrow. If she refuses again, we do it our way." Their chairs scraped back. I darted into the darkened parlor just before they came down the hall. My heart thudded against my ribs as they passed, their footsteps heavy, their shadows stretching long across the walls. I waited until I heard their bedroom doors close before I dared move again. In the silence that followed, I sank into the old armchair by the window. My chest ached, not just from fear but from the kind of hurt that only betrayal can carve. I thought of their baby faces, of bedtime stories, of scraped knees I'd kissed better. I thought of nights spent awake sewing Halloween costumes, of afternoons at ball games cheering louder than anyone else. All of it for what? To be cornered in my own home, treated like a stubborn obstacle in the way of their prize. I wanted to march into their rooms, demand answers, shout until my throat broke. But I didn't. Instead, I sat very still, staring out at the storm-slick streets. Because I knew the truth. Anger would only feed their cause. They would twist it, call me confused, frail, incapable. They'd drag me into signing just to prove I wasn't losing my grip. No, if I was to fight this, I'd have to be clever. The library was my fortress. My books had never betrayed me, not once. Somewhere inside those shelves lay my defense. I had no plan yet, only the fragile beginning of resolve. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let them see my fear. When the morning came, I brewed coffee as if nothing had happened. I smiled when they shuffled into the kitchen, pretending I hadn't heard a word of their whispers. Martin asked casually if I'd thought more about the papers. I poured his coffee without meeting his eyes. "I'll get to it," I said lightly. They exchanged glances, suspicious but uncertain. After they left for their errands, I walked straight to the library. My key shook in the lock, but once inside, the familiar hush steadied me. The shelves rose like sentinels around me, my silent allies. I ran my hand over the spines, whispering to them like old friends. I wasn't helpless. Not yet. But I had to move carefully. The storm inside my own blood was fiercer than any thunder outside. And I'd only just begun to glimpse how far it would go. The library always smelled strongest in the mornings. Dust and leather, a whisper of mildew from the old heating pipes. It was a perfume I knew better than any store-bought kind. That morning I decided to straighten the history section, a job no one else liked because the volumes were heavy and the bindings delicate. My joints complained as I bent and lifted, but I pressed on. Better to be sore from books than from idleness. I pulled one of the great tomes down, an oversized volume I hadn't touched in years. The cover was cracked, its edges flaking, the sort of book most patrons avoided. I carried it to the desk, brushing away a line of dust. As I opened it, something strange caught my eye. A sliver of sealed parchment wedged deep between the pages. I frowned and tugged gently. Out slid a bundle, folded tight, tied with faded string. My breath caught. The wax seal was brittle but intact, stamped with a crest I didn't recognize, though it had the look of something very old, 15th century, maybe earlier. Hands trembling, I untied the string and unfolded the pages. The ink was faded but legible. The hand beautiful, curling letters that seemed to breathe on the parchment. I didn't understand the language fully, but the script itself radiated significance. This wasn't a letter or a scrap, it was a manuscript. An original. For a long moment I just sat there, the library silent around me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I thought of Henry's words about hidden treasures. Could this be one of them? More than that, could this be the very thing my children were sniffing after without even knowing? The door slammed. I nearly dropped the manuscript. My children swept in as if they owned the place, their voices sharp with annoyance. Martin called out first. "Mama, you've been here since dawn? You shouldn't strain yourself like this." His tone was syrup, but his eyes darted to the desk. Daniel's gaze followed his and then froze. "What's that?" I clutched the manuscript instinctively to my chest. Nothing. Just an old book that needed sorting. But I'd already made the mistake of letting them see. Carol stepped forward, her hand hovering over the fragile pages. "That doesn't look like nothing. Where did you get it?" "It belongs here," I snapped, sharper than I intended. My voice echoed in the hushed room. "It's library property." Martin gave a short, cold laugh. "Library property, Mama? Or yours? You've guarded this place your whole life like it was your personal vault." He reached for the manuscript and I pulled back. "Don't," I said firmly. "These are delicate. You'll ruin it." Daniel leaned closer, eyes glittering. "Delicate or not, if it's worth something, we need to know. This could be it, the thing that makes all the fuss worth it." I felt cornered, the shelves rising around me like witnesses. My hands trembled, but I didn't let go. "This is not yours to take," I said. My voice shook, but it held. Carol bit her lip, torn between fear and greed. Martin didn't hesitate. He leaned across the desk, close enough that I could see the vein pulsing at his temple. "Stop being stubborn, Mama. If you care about us at all, you'll share what you've been hiding." The word share tasted like ash. They weren't talking about sharing, they were talking about seizing. I slipped the manuscript back into its cover and pressed it against my chest. This library has been my life's work. Not a payday. Not a lottery ticket. And I'll thank you to remember it. The air between us thickened. For a moment no one moved. Then, reluctantly, Martin straightened. His jaw was tight, his hands fists at his sides. "Fine," he said finally. "But don't think you can keep it locked away forever. We'll find out what it is." They turned and left, their footsteps echoing down the marble floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sank into the chair, the manuscript still clutched tight, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the ticking clock. I didn't know exactly what I held, but I knew this. Its worth was more than money. It was power. And now my children had seen it. I rewrapped the manuscript in its cracked cover and tucked it into a satchel, pressing it close to my body as I locked up the library. Every step home I felt exposed, as if eyes were on me from every corner. That night I lay awake, the satchel under my bed. I thought of the whispers I'd heard in my kitchen, of the hunger in their eyes when they spotted the manuscript. I thought of the storm still gathering in my own house. The betrayal had been bad enough before. But now? Now the stakes had changed. And I feared the hunt was about to begin. The night after I found the manuscript, sleep never came. I lay still, listening to the smallest sounds in the house. The tick of the hall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the floor creaks that seemed louder than usual. My children had seen what I had uncovered, and I knew it had changed something. They no longer thought of me as stubborn. They thought of me as an obstacle standing in front of their prize. By morning, the air inside the house felt different, charged. When I came into the kitchen, Martin was already there, hunched over a cup of coffee like he'd been waiting. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Carol moved back and forth between the counter and the table, setting things out she didn't mean for anyone to eat. "Where is it?" Martin asked without preamble. I played dumb. "Where's what?" "The book. The papers inside it. Don't start with us, Mama. We're not children anymore." My hands tightened around the dish towel. "And I'm not senile. Whatever you think you saw, it belongs to the library. Not to you. Not to me." Daniel's mouth curled into something that wasn't a smile. "Stop pretending. We know what we saw. You've hidden things from us before, but this is different." I turned away, busying myself with the teapot. If they wanted to wrestle me down into an argument, I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But I could feel their eyes on my back, sharp and watchful. That afternoon, when I went to phone Henry, I found the line dead. I tried again. Nothing. I checked my cell, an old flip model I barely used, no signal. A chill went through me. Martin appeared in the doorway, his tone falsely gentle. "Oh, don't worry about the phone. It's acting up. We'll take care of it." I nodded, but inside my heart sank. They weren't going to let me call for help. The hunt had begun. That evening, I caught Daniel rifling through my desk drawers. When I asked what he was doing, he didn't even flinch. "Looking for bills," he lied. "You forget things sometimes." He slammed the drawer shut before I could protest. Carol lingered in the library room, her hand tracing the spines as if she were memorizing where I'd hidden the treasure. She smiled thinly when I caught her. "Just reminiscing," she said, but her eyes told another story. I couldn't keep the manuscript under my bed forever. They would search there first, perhaps already had. I had to think. Somewhere they'd never look, somewhere that would repel their interest. And then it came to me. The children's section of the library. Those shelves were bright and low, lined with fairy tales sticky from decades of small hands. My children hadn't looked at those books since they were toddlers, And I knew they wouldn't now. To them, children's books were worthless, mere clutter. But to me, they were a shield. The next morning, I slipped out before they were awake. At the library, the silence welcomed me back. I walked straight to the children's aisle, knelt down, and slid the manuscript deep into the middle of a row of worn picture books, right between Goodnight Moon and a ragged old collection of nursery rhymes. I stacked other books over it, hiding it in plain sight. As I stood, my knees aching, I whispered a prayer under my breath. Let them overlook it. Just let them pass it by. When I came home, the storm broke fully. Martin confronted me at the door. Daniel right behind him. Where is it? Martin barked. I told you, I said, my voice steady. It belongs to the library. His face darkened. He stepped closer, looming. Don't play games with us. We're not fools. You can't keep this from us forever. Carol, softer but no less cruel, added, Mama, if you really love us, you'll share it. Why should you hold on to it when it could change our lives? I looked at the three of them, the same children I had fed, rocked to sleep, read stories to, and I felt a grief deeper than fear. Because it's not mine to give, I said simply. For a moment's silence. Then Martin cursed and stormed down the hall, slamming doors, searching rooms. Daniel followed. Carol lingered, her eyes pleading in a way that was almost worse. Then she too turned away. That night I sat alone in the parlor, the phone still dead, the air thick with threat. They were circling me, waiting for a weakness. But they wouldn't find the manuscript here. It was hidden where their greed would never stoop to look. Among the stories meant for children, stories of honesty and courage they had long forgotten. And I prayed that would be enough to keep it safe, at least for now. By the third day of the silence, I knew I couldn't hold them off forever. My sons stormed through the house like inspectors, opening cupboards, shifting cushions, watching me with sharp, accusing eyes. Carol stayed quieter, her voice softer, but her persistence was no less cutting. And the phones, they'd left them dead. No calls in, no calls out. I needed help, but it would have to come from outside. Someone they wouldn't suspect. That's when I thought of Arthur Caldwell. He had been a professor once, a collector always. He used to stop by the library to borrow rare editions, and over the years we'd struck up a friendship. He had the same reverence for books I did, and he knew their value in ways my children never could. I sent word through a neighbor boy, scribbling a note that looked innocent on the outside. Please come by, medical visit, and slipped it into his hand along with a dime for candy. I watched from the window as he trotted down the street, my heart pounding. 2 mornings later, Arthur arrived. He came dressed plainly, carrying a black doctor's bag, his hat pulled low. To anyone watching, he was just a physician checking on an ailing woman. But when I opened the door, the look in his eyes told me he understood. Where is it? He whispered once we were alone in the library. I led him to the children's section. My knees creaked as I bent, pulling aside Goodnight Moon and the battered nursery rhymes. The manuscript slid into view, still wrapped in its cracked cover. Arthur's hands trembled as he lifted it. He placed it on the table, adjusted his spectacles, and began to examine it with the precision of a jeweler. Minutes stretched long. I sat across from him, twisting my hands in my lap, waiting. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were wide. This isn't just valuable, he said softly. It's extraordinary. 15th century without question. The seal is authentic. And the script? He ran a finger lightly along the edge of the parchment. This could be worth tens of millions. Do you understand, my dear? You've been sitting on a treasure the world would fight wars over. My breath caught. I had imagined value, yes, but not this. Not millions. I pressed a hand to my chest, the weight of his words heavier than the manuscript itself. Before I could respond, the door burst open. Martin stood in the frame, Daniel behind him, Carol peering over their shoulders. They had been listening. What did you just say? Martin barked, striding in. His eyes darted from Arthur to the manuscript, his jaw tight. Millions? Did I hear that right? Arthur tried to straighten, but Daniel shoved past him, his eyes gleaming with hunger. So it's true. You've been hiding it all along. Our future, sitting in the children's aisle like garbage. Carol's voice trembled, but it carried an edge. Mama, why didn't you tell us? We could have handled this together. Do you know what this could do for us? Arthur bristled. This manuscript doesn't belong to you. It is hers to decide what to do with. Martin sneered. Stay out of this, old man. He lunged for the book, but I stepped in front of it, my arms spread. No. My voice came out stronger than I expected. You will not touch this. The air grew thick with tension. For a long, terrible moment, none of us moved. Then Martin stepped back, breathing hard, his fists clenched. Fine, he spat. But you can't keep this hidden forever. The neighbors will know, the whole town will know. And when they do, don't expect anyone to believe you over your own children. They stormed out, slamming the door so hard the shelves trembled. Arthur sank into a chair, his face pale. My dear, you're in danger, he said quietly. This isn't just about greed anymore. They'll destroy themselves and you before they let this go. I lowered myself into the chair opposite, my hands shaking. What am I supposed to do? He hesitated, then placed his hand gently over mine. You protect it however you must. But know this, you're not alone. I'll help you. Whatever storm they bring, you won't face it without an ally. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. Outside, I could already hear my children's raised voices, carrying across the yard for the neighbors to hear. Shouts, accusations, staged arguments that painted me as difficult, confused. A show for anyone who might be watching. Arthur squeezed my hand. Hold fast, he said. The truth will outlast them. But in that moment, with the storm battering louder at my very walls, I wasn't so sure. The house grew noisier after Arthur's visit. My children no longer bothered with whispers. They argued openly, voices rising like thunder, doors slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. Neighbors began casting glances over the fence when they passed. I could see the pity in their eyes, but not one dared step closer. Martin was the worst of them. His temper boiled day and night. He paced the halls, muttering, snapping at Carol, barking at Daniel. And then one evening I noticed something missing. The satchel where Arthur had briefly placed the manuscript. It was gone. My stomach twisted. I searched quietly. The manuscript itself was still safe, hidden back among the children's books. But in its place I found cheap parchment sheets scattered across Martin's desk, along with a bottle of brown ink and a feather quill bought from the craft store. The truth chilled me, he was trying to copy it. First I almost laughed. The arrogance of it. My son, who never cared for books, squinting at parchment, tracing letters he couldn't even pronounce, trying to mimic a hand trained centuries ago. But as the days passed, the laughter died. He was serious. Deadly serious. I overheard him late at night, speaking low into the phone. Yes, I've got something. 15th century. Untouched. Authentic. A pause. Then his voice sharper. No, of course it's real. Do you think I waste your time? He hung up when he heard me stirring, but I'd heard enough. He was arranging a sale. The next morning, Martin left early, carrying a slim case under his arm. Carol's eyes darted nervously, but she said nothing. Daniel pretended not to notice, though his jaw clenched tight. I stood at the window, watching my eldest march down the drive, and prayed the lie would collapse before it ruined us all. It didn't take long. By evening he was back. Face pale, shirt damp with sweat, the slim case empty. He slammed it on the table, sending papers flying. They laughed at me. He spat, his voice ragged. Do you understand? Laughed. Called it a child's toy, a school project. Said if I tried again, they'd call the police. Carol gasped, covering her mouth. Daniel cursed under his breath. I stayed very still, my hands folded in my lap. Martin, I said softly, you've gone too far. He turned on me, his eyes wild. Too far? This is your fault. If you just signed when we asked, none of this would have happened. His words stung like whips, but I didn't flinch. Better their laughter than prison, I said. For a moment I thought he might strike me. His fists clenched, his chest heaved, and then he collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Carol began to cry. Daniel snapped at her to hush, but his voice trembled too. The weight of it all was crashing down on them, the futility of their schemes, the danger of the path they'd chosen. The phone rang then. A sharp, sudden sound that startled us all. Carol lunged for it, but froze as the voice on the other end announced itself loud enough for me to hear. The police. They wanted to speak to Martin. He grabbed the receiver, stammered excuses, denied everything, but his voice cracked. I sat quietly, my heart heavy. The law had entered our home, not through my doing, but through his. When he hung up, the silence was thick. They're investigating, he muttered. Said someone filed a complaint about attempted fraud. His eyes flicked to me, full of accusation. Did you do this? I shook my head. No, Martin. You did it to yourself. For once, Daniel didn't defend him. He just sat back, staring at the floor, his shoulders sagging. Carol wiped her eyes, whispering, What's going to happen to us? I rose slowly, my knees stiff, my voice quiet but firm. What happens is up to you. But hear me now, this manuscript is not a ticket, not a prize. It's history. And if you keep trying to twist it into money, it will break you before it saves you. They didn't answer. They just sat there, 3 grown children, looking smaller than I'd seen them in years. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I lay awake, the manuscript hidden far from their reach, and wondered what the police would uncover next. My children had crossed a line, and there would be no turning back. The storm was no longer just inside my house. Now it echoed in the halls of justice. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and nerves. I hadn't been in one since I was a girl on jury duty, and back then the cases had been about petty theft and traffic fines. Now it was my own children sitting at the defendant's table, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. I sat straight-backed in the witness box, my hands folded in my lap. The bailiff's voice echoed, All rise. We rose. The judge swept in, robes heavy, her eyes sharp. She settled, and so did we. But the tension in that room never loosened. The prosecutor laid it all out with crisp efficiency. Forged documents. Attempts to trick me into signing away my library for pennies. The failed forgery of the manuscript. The buyers who had reported Martin's scheme to the police. Each piece was laid like a brick in a wall, higher and higher, until even I felt buried by the weight of it. When they read aloud my own son's words from a recorded call, It's worth millions, we'll sign for her if she won't. I felt my chest cave in. He stared down at the table, jaw tight, refusing to meet my eyes. My lawyer rose then, a young woman sharp as glass. She guided me gently through my testimony. I told the truth, how my children had visited after my diagnosis, how they brought papers under the guise of insurance, how I had nearly signed before catching the word transfer. I described Henry's visit, Arthur's inspection, the discovery of the manuscript hidden between centuries-old pages. My voice shook, but I did not falter. And how did your children respond? The lawyer asked. I swallowed hard. They grew different. Angrier. It was no longer about my health or comfort. It was about what they could take. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens. When the defense finally spoke, their words felt hollow. Carol's lawyer painted her as a bystander, merely caught up in her brother's plans. Daniel's claimed he had been pressured, swept along. Martin's defense was blunt denial. She misunderstood. She's elderly. Confused. The words stung, but they did not stick. Too much evidence lay against them. The hardest moment came when the prosecutor asked if I still considered myself their victim. I looked across the room at them. My children. My babies grown tall, faces lined with age but still holding echoes of the toddlers I once rocked. Martin stared at the table. Daniel scowled. Carol wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Yes, I said softly. I am their victim. But I am also their mother. And that makes this the deepest wound of all. Gasps rippled through the gallery. I heard a neighbor whisper my name. The judge's pen scratched across her notes. The trial stretched over days. Experts testified about the manuscript. Its authenticity beyond doubt, its value staggering. Collectors spoke of history, of preservation, of cultural treasure. Each word only deepened the contrast between the artifact's dignity and my children's betrayal. At last, the closing arguments. The prosecutor's voice rang clear. This case is not about greed alone. It is about trust broken at its most sacred level, children conspiring against their mother, not strangers against a stranger. If the law means anything, it must mean protection for the most vulnerable, even from those who should be protectors themselves. The defense mumbled through half-hearted pleas, but the damage was done. The judge's verdict came swift and stern. Fraud. Attempted theft. Conspiracy. The words struck like hammer blows. Sentences would follow in due time, but already the truth was fixed. My children had stood as defendants and I as the wronged. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the cool afternoon air, the reporters swarmed. Microphones, flashing cameras, questions shouted over one another. How does it feel, ma'am, to have one? Do you plan to reconcile with your children? What will you do with the manuscript now that it's proven genuine? I lifted my hand, shielding my eyes from the glare. This isn't victory, I said quietly. It's survival. And survival always comes at a cost. Arthur was waiting at the edge of the steps. He took my elbow gently, guiding me past the chaos to his car. You spoke with dignity, he said. You did what needed to be done. I nodded, but inside I felt hollow. Justice had been served, yes, but the price was a family broken beyond repair. That night, back at the library, I walked the aisles alone. The manuscript was locked away, safe, its value now undeniable. But as I ran my hands over the familiar spines of books I'd loved for decades, I whispered to them what I could not say aloud. They were mine. And now they're gone. The truth had been told, the law had spoken, and the weight of it pressed heavy on my heart. The manuscript never came back to the house. After the trial, Arthur insisted it be moved to a secure vault until the collectors could make their offers. I agreed. The sight of it had stirred too much ugliness under my own roof. The offers came fast, letters typed on thick paper, calls routed through lawyers. Each number was larger than the last. Tens of millions, Arthur had said, and now I saw it written plain. I could have chosen any one of them, but I didn't rush. I thought of the library, of the shelves I had tended since I was barely more than a girl. I thought of the children's corner, where I'd hidden the manuscript, safe because it was surrounded by stories meant for innocence. In the end, I chose a consortium of collectors, scholars more than buyers, men and women who spoke not of profit but of preservation. When the contract was signed, I held the pen steady, my name flowing strong across the page. The irony wasn't lost on me, how close I had come to signing everything away in deceit, and how, in truth, my signature now saved it all. The sum staggered even me. Enough to live 10 lives, though I had only one left to live. The reporters came again, eager for statements, for photographs of me smiling with the check in hand. I refused them. The money mattered less than the peace it bought. The library was mine again, secured legally, shielded from anyone who might try to pry it loose. I used part of the funds to repair the old building, new roof, polish floors, better heating for the winter. But I kept its soul the same. Wooden shelves, brass knobs, the hush that welcomed every visitor like a prayer. I opened it to the town as a cultural center. Children's story hours returned, louder and brighter than before. Retired men came to read newspapers. Young scholars came to pore over history books. I gave lectures once a month, my voice trembling at first but growing steadier, sharing what I knew about the beauty of books that had outlived wars and betrayals. Neighbors began calling it Grandma's Library. I didn't mind. It was a title I could carry proudly. As for my children, I struck them from my will. That decision was harder than signing the sale, harder than facing them in court. But dignity demanded it. They had treated my love as a resource to be drained. I could not leave them more. The letters came, of course. Pleas, apologies, sometimes rage written in hurried hands. I read a few then stopped. My heart had been broken enough times. I would not keep reopening it like a wound. But I did not grow bitter. I tended the garden behind the library, grew roses that climbed the fence, tomatoes that neighbors carried home in paper bags. I baked pies again, sometimes blueberry, sometimes apple, and brought them to the community gatherings we hosted in the library's hall. One evening, as the sun set through the stained glass window, casting the room in amber light, I stood in the center of the library and listened. Children laughing, pages turning, a hush falling now and then, not from fear but from wonder. And I realized I had not lost everything. I had gained something new. A family not of blood but of community, people who cherished what I cherished, who respected what my own children had dismissed. The manuscript had saved more than my library. It had saved me. I walked to the shelves and pressed my hand to the spines, whispering as I always did when I was alone. Thank you. Because in the end, it was the books themselves that had carried me through. Their silence, their patience, their endurance. They had outlasted betrayal, and so had I. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.